Hello and most welcome to 2032 of the H series. We will today continue where we left off in 2031. Synchronicity, acausal connection, and the fractal dynamics of clinical practice. Clinical practice. Last time we took a look at some new approach to the Cartesian split. How to approach it. And this is this rather novel and interesting approach, which is what Marks-Tarlow calls fractal epistemology. Fractal epistemology. And as you can see on page 469, this is also about 7 lines or 6 lines into the second paragraph. We introduced the term transsubjective. To indicate a realm beyond subjectivity, and intersubjectivity that transcends internal experience to include elements of the external world. The external world. The external world. Intersubjectivity is the understanding that goes over the both sides and takes presence in the liminal zone, in the in-betweenness. Practical here is to use the metaphor or the trope of the Norwegian coastline. It is not the coastline in itself, neither is it the surrounding nothingness, aka water, but it is in the betweenness, the interpenetration of the one side into the other. There is a border zone in between, a frontier. Here is what everything takes place. Everything, bar nothing. This fractality you can find everywhere. It is constantly present in our veins, in the development of time, which is, as we saw last session, scale invariant as something that also applies to space. Scale invariant. Scale invariant. scale invariant. There is a connection there. The scale invariance itself also gives the understanding that it is the liminal zone, not the separable estates or existences that are of significant and important role. With scale invariance, we have shape instead of mass, extension, width, breadth, length. The perpendicular orthogonal x, y, z's of the Cartesian dimensions do not work in scale invariance. Beyond scales, that makes no sense at all to speak of distance in that old way. Instead, we enter into the real world, the world of real things. One pointer to this came from Robert Stolorov at the end of this page. He first suggested that the observer is the observed in his doctoral thesis. Faces in the clouds, faces in the clouds. Faces in the clouds. Faces in the clouds. Go to page 470, you mention this is a non-reductive new approach that do not strand in idealism or postmodernism. We stir free both from Scylla and the Charybdis of either idealism or materialism. These two sides equally refer to the two sides that are on either side of the in-betweenness of everything. This is nicely put here. A few lines down. Why the reductive neuroscience privileges downward reduction of mind to brain, exclusive focus on subjectivity in psychoanalysis perpetuates the upward reduction by omitting wider physiological and physical reality. Reality. So reality is in the betweenness. This is where everything is hidden, where it exists. In the betweenness, stir free from that, as I said. Two downfalls are either idealism or reductionism. Thereby, we do not fall either into the trap of the two sides of the Norwegian coastline, the material part and the non-existent part, so to speak. We continue on page 471. A bit down on the page. And we'll be talking about Sue, who had dreams and had an invisibility incident with her psychologist. The case of Sue illustrates how clinical intuition dovetails with fractal dynamics. Marks-Tarlow initially hesitated to mention Sue's act of omission for fear of shaming her, since this patient was ordinarily perfectly on time and impeccably coiffed. It was also unusual for this therapist to begin a session. Yet Marks-Tarlow sensed the significance of the moment, intuiting that Sue's instinct would be quickly move on to hide any imperfections. Any imperfections. The choice to speak out illustrates what she refers to as fractal consciousness. Fractal consciousness. Sue. The capacity to intuitively detect patterns of the whole within brief slivers of relational experience. Relational experience. relational experience. Fractal consciousness may represent the essence of all intuitive response, whether of the ordinary or extraordinary variety. Variety, the extraordinary variety. Which may include uncanny experiences in the therapy setting and everyday life. Everyday life. Everyday life. Clinical intuition can be understood as an implicit, spontaneous, right brain dominant mode of open awareness. From McGilchrist. That facilitates effortless perception of recursively enfolded self-similar, very important, scale invariant patterning within ourselves, others, and the world at large. Psychodynamic clinicians are highly skilled at recognizing such implicit dynamics inherent in the patient's patterns of feeling, thinking, and relating, including the transference, counter-transference interplay that facilitates explicit awareness, explicit awareness, explicit awareness. Awareness coming to play here as well. Through fractal lenses, we unconsciously sense the fine texture of experience during clinical interactions. During clinical interactions. During clinical interactions. Clinical interactions. Partly by linking patterns in those tiny now movements with self-similar patterns surrounding larger events and conceptualizations. Conceptualizations. Fractal consciousness also underlines our sense of self-identity extended in time, allowing us to gain and retain perspective by linking small and large-scale self-similar events of our lives into meaningful and cohesive self-narrative. Into meaningful and cohesive self-narrative. Without fractality, we will become unglued. We will not stick together. There would be cuts in our personality. We will dissolve into linearity. Fractal boundary conditions. During the past 100 years, as psychoanalysis has turned more fully toward a two-person perspective, clinical theory has also drawn more heavily upon non-linear concepts of self-organization and emergence emerge now. nonlinear models wreak havoc on traditional notions of boundaries. Of boundaries. In recent writings, the authors presented a fractal epistemology framework for understanding the complex operation of psychological boundaries, including the paradoxical features of simultaneously separating and uniting adjacent domains. Uniting and separating adjacent domains. Whereas the boundaries of human-made objects like cups and tables, are clean and easily resolvable. The boundaries of fractal objects are rough, ambiguous, and infinitely deep. Infinitely deep. Infinitely deep, having no end to them. Infinite deep, infinite depth, never-ending depth, getting deeper and deeper, larger and larger, never-ending. That is the infinite depth of reality and our inside. Infinite depth, infinitely deep. In Descartes' error, Antonio Damasio points out the fallacy of trying to draw clean boundaries to separate mind from body. To separate mind from body. To separate mind from body. fractal boundaries capture the natural complexity of interpersonal edges, including semi-permeability between self-other, brain-mind, and inner-outer realms. Inner-outer realms. Inner outer realms. Inner outer realms. One important feature of fractal boundaries, highly relevant to clinical practice, is the property of observer dependence. An idea anticipated by Mayer, quote, the subtlety of what we observe depends on the nature of the instrument through which we look. Through which we look. In contrast to computer-generated fractals, which have infinite depth, the edges of physical fractals existing in nature are finitely bounded by conditions of the material world. Of the material world. Yet, much like the computer generated fractals, fractals which have infinite depth. The edges of physical fractals existing in nature are finitely bounded by conditions of the material world. Of the material world. Yet, much like the computer-generated fractals, psychological boundaries between people remain functionally unbounded. Unbounded. As clinicians, we understand the potentially infinite depth through this simple, intuitive principle. The closer we look at someone, the more there is to see. The same principle applies as readily to our relationship with ourselves as to our relationships with others, with others, with others. They are also fractal, definitely and clearly fractal in their interpenetrative nature with others. The same principle applies as readily to our relationship with others as to our relationships with others. The same disorder will manifest differently in different patients and within different patient therapists' diets. Diets! Diets! Diets. In therapy, as in science, how we look influences what we see, rendering transference and countertransference inevitable. Whether consciously or unconsciously registered, consciously or unconsciously registered. The detection of self-similar patterns may extend from intuitions, more ordinary ways, ordinary variety, based on physical presence and concrete sensory experiences, local interactive channels, local interactive channels. Local interactive channels. To extraordinary knowing, where valid information becomes available through extrasensory, non-local, participatory sharing. Non-local, participatory sharing. Uncanny information sharing. Uncanny information sharing. The topic of extrasensory information sharing at a distance, whether in space or across time, has been a subject of great interest to psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysts. Many founding figures of psychoanalysis, including Freud, Jung, Ferenczi, Fodor, Ehrenwald, reported instances of apparent psi phenomena such as telepathy, precognition, and synchronicity in the past century of clinical work. Clinical work. Freud remained fascinated with the observations of telepathic thought in transference throughout his career and argued for rigorous observational data to document it, to document it. to document it, to make it documentable, to make it documentable, to make it documentable. He proposed an early model of telepathy as a form of unconscious communication at the threshold between the repressed and consciously accessible information. Information. Using only a handful of cases. Freud was able to show that the manifest content of telepathically obtained information may not be veridical, but instead follows the same processes of dynamic unconscious that operate on manifest dream content. Dream content. So in dreams, you have a similarity. Telepathy in the fractal sense comes through dreams. Dream content, it's an excellent pause. 2032. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Excuse me. Digressing a bit here. Let me go through the paper. Let's see here. There are quite some interesting takes here. Page 471 already. No, I'll go to 472. Here. At the second line, brief slivers of relational experience. Brief slivers of relational experience. So a little goes a long way. And this is very close to William Blake's in a grain, the whole world, the grain of sand, the whole world. in a moment, eternity. Small slivers brings about everything. Later, we come to a mentioning of dreams by Freud. These dreams are telepathic, according to him, and they bring forth things in a different way, not the regular way, but in an absolutely new way. There's an interesting comment here. Clinical intuition can be understood as an implicit, spontaneous, right brain dominant mode of open awareness. So in the right brain, we can access fractality, the slivers. These are so fine-grained, so in the linear left hemisphere take, they will not be recognized, noticed, nor understood. Patently, they will not be there. We will not realize them. Only in the more encompassing, the greater, the wider, the expanded, open awareness can we see the fractal signs, the slivers, because they are self-similar, scale-invariant patterning within ourselves, others, and the world at large. We also need ourselves, so act as a kaleidoscope for these slivers. Without an in-depth understanding of ourselves, we can neither reach out to the outer hemispheres, the outsideness. We need both. Without self-understanding, there will be no outside understanding. That is especially clear to go further down about the 10th line. Through fractal lenses, we unconsciously sense the fine texture of experience. This it is. That is the kaleidoscope, also sometimes called the focal setting. The focal setting. The right hemisphere open take that can go into the finest details without losing itself. Both are needed. Later down in the next session or paragraph or sub-rubric, sorry, sub-rubric, fractal boundary conditions. In the second paragraph, 7 lines down, one important feature of fractal boundaries, highly relevant to clinical practice, is the property of observer dependence. This is the kaleidoscope. With the right hemisphere, you come into the observer dependence. You develop and deepen your own depth. So you become more extended and larger, and through that magnifying glass, the deeper it is, the more you will see the focal setting or the telescope. It's a combination of a telescope and a microscope, doing both things, and through your personality, that will become possible. The more you go into your own life, accepting, adjusting, lovingly, caringly, all strains very important at this instance. That is sine qua non. Fourth line from the bottom here. In therapy, as in science, how we look influences what we see, rendering transference and counter-transference inevitable. This is the exogenous looking out and the endogenous coming in. Remember the neurons in the eye that are three times more information going from the eyes than to them. You do something when you look. It is not a passive camera or a camcorder or a video recorder. Nothing of that. It's an absolutely active process where you and your depth is so all important. Without what, nothing will be developed. Nothing will happen. You will not have this development. You will not be able to see if your personality is not sharpened like the kaleidoscope or that fractal lens. And that goes to show self-development, advancement of ourselves, progressing. It is most important, and in the end, the slivers be so fine, so they could even be called extrasensory or telepathic. They will be grand, but it demands that you go into yourself, develop yourself in context with the exogenous, in your interactions with others. Because there is an enormity of possible development. I end there, saying thank you very much for listening in. Have a pleasant morning, day, or afternoon. Bye-bye for now.